a quiet welcome to Restful Historian. Tonight, our unique voyage gently carries us across the landscapes of medieval Europe, inviting us to explore a pivotal, profoundly transformative moment in its history. We embark on a journey through the captivating saga of the Black Death. Tonight, we'll delve into the very heart of this extraordinary pandemic, exploring its mysterious origins, its inexorable spread, the immediate societal chaos it brought, and, most crucially, the deep, long-lasting transformations it ignited across the continent. We will focus not on the suffering, but on the historical context, the profound societal shifts, and the enduring legacy of an event that reshaped human destiny. This is a story of immense challenge, unforeseen change, and the unyielding spirit of humanity in the face of the unimaginable. So, find your most comfortable space. Close your eyes and let's ease into tonight's story together. Chapter 1. Europe on the Eve of Plague. Imagine the early to mid-14th century, a period stretching roughly from the beginning of the 1300s to the pivotal year of 1347. This was, in many significant ways, a remarkably vibrant and dynamic era for Europe. After centuries of slow, arduous recovery from the widespread disruptions that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the subsequent period often termed the Dark Ages, the continent had experienced a truly extraordinary era of sustained growth and expansion. This period, often referred to as the High Middle Ages, saw an unprecedented surge in population. Estimates vary, but historical demographers suggest that Europe's populace may have nearly doubled or even tripled between the 10th and 13th centuries, potentially reaching a staggering 75 to 80 million people. Picture, in your mind's eye, once small villages gradually expanding into bustling towns, and these towns, in turn, transforming into vibrant, growing cities, often pushing beyond their original protective walls. Their narrow, winding streets teemed with the vibrant energy of merchants displaying their wares, skilled artisans crafting their goods, and countless laborers engaged in the daily rhythm of life. The countryside, too, reflected this demographic surge. Virtually every arable acre of land, from the rolling hills of England to the fertile plains of Lombardy, was painstakingly brought under the plough to sustain this burgeoning population. This impressive demographic boom, while undeniably a testament to flourishing prosperity and agricultural innovation, also inadvertently created a vast, intricately interconnected human network, a perfect, expansive canvas upon which a fast-spreading disease could paint a horrifying masterpiece of destruction. At the very heart of this thriving medieval society lay the deeply entrenched and pervasive feudal system. This was far more than just a political structure. It was a complex, almost organic web of interdependent relationships, meticulously binding powerful lords to their loyal vassals, and diligent knights to the diligent, hard-working peasants. The overwhelming majority of the population, perhaps as much as 85 to 90%, lived directly on the land in the rural landscape, inextricably tied to the soil they cultivated. These peasants, often known as serfs, were not slaves, but their lives were bound by a complex set of obligations to their lords. They owed various forms of labor service, working the lord's land, paid rents, often in kind, like a portion of their harvest, or sometimes in coin, and pledged unwavering loyalty. In exchange, they received a measure of protection from brigands and external threats, and the fundamental right to cultivate small plots of land for their own sustenance, ensuring their survival. This system, while providing a certain degree of social order and agricultural stability, also meant that populations were largely sedentary, clustered tightly in compact villages, and frequently lived in remarkably close proximity to their domestic livestock. Their cattle, sheep, and fowl often shared barns or even parts of their humble dwellings for warmth. Imagine the inherent challenges of these close quarters, the unpaved paths serving as village streets, often muddy and filled with refuse, and the rudimentary waste disposal practices even in the most conscientious communities. These collective factors inadvertently created ideal conditions for the proliferation of common pests, particularly rodents and their unseen companions, fleas, tiny, silent biological carriers that would soon play a terrifying and pivotal role in the unfolding catastrophe. Beyond the intimate confines of the rural manor, Europe was becoming increasingly knitted together by increasingly active and intricate trade routes. Picture not just the familiar local markets within a lord's domain, where local produce and crafts were exchanged, but the great, pulsing arteries of commerce that tirelessly crisscrossed the entire continent and stretched far beyond its traditional boundaries. The legendary Silk Road to the east, for instance, was not a single, paved superhighway, but rather a vast, complex, and interconnected tapestry of pathways for caravans, a sprawling web of trails, rugged mountain passes, and fertile oasis towns that tirelessly wove through forbidding deserts, formidable mountain ranges, and rich fertile lands. This ancient network eventually linked the distant, powerful empires of China and India with the vibrant civilizations of the Middle East and, ultimately, the emerging societies of Europe. For centuries, this colossal artery facilitated the exchange of an astonishing array of goods, from exotic spices and luxurious silks to precious metals, intricate ceramics, and innovative technologies. But inevitably, and tragically, it also served as an unwitting conduit for unseen forces, including diseases. Imagine the slow, relentless, yet persistent movement of these caravans, resilient merchants leading their pack animals, accompanied by numerous servants and sometimes soldiers for protection, and, critically, laden with their provisions and baggage. These provisions often included large quantities of grains and other foodstuffs, which, in turn, irresistibly attracted swarms of rodents. As these caravans traversed thousands of miles, pausing for rest and trade at countless inns, bustling trading posts, and major cities along the way, the ubiquitous black rat, Rattus rattus, often called the house rat or ship rat, and its parasitic passengers, the highly efficient fleas, carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium, could travel stealthily with them. A single infected rat, weakened by the bacterium and dying quietly along the route, would cause its fleas, now desperate for a new blood meal to survive, to abandon the cooling corpse and frantically seek a new host, perhaps another unsuspecting rat, or, tragically, a nearby human. This slow, steady leapfrogging of the disease, from one rodent population to the next, from one way station to the next, was the silent, inexorable mechanism of the plague's vast expansion across continents. Within Europe itself, vital coastal shipping routes were bustling with activity, forming another critical network for disease transmission. Imagine the prosperous ports of the Mediterranean, such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, their harbors crowded with masts and sails, serving as indispensable links with the distant Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Black Sea. To the north, the powerful Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, dominated the intricate web of trade in the Baltic and North Seas, linking Scandinavia, the thriving German states, and the developing Kingdom of England. These highly efficient maritime networks were incredibly adept at moving vast quantities of goods and, tragically, disease, from one bustling port to the next, often with a speed that utterly defied the comprehension and defensive capabilities of medieval observers. The very success of their trade made them vulnerable. This seemingly thriving, intricately interconnected world, however, was also grappling with significant underlying stresses, some of which had already begun to cast long, ominous shadows. Europe had recently endured a period of less favorable climate, a climatic shift often referred to by historians as the Little Ice Age, which had slowly begun to manifest during the early decades of the 14th century. Imagine a subtle but persistent shift towards cooler average temperatures, resulting in shorter and less predictable growing seasons, and often accompanied by increased, frequently torrential, rainfall. These changing weather patterns led to repeated and devastating crop failures. This culminated in the agonizing Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a widespread catastrophe of starvation, severe malnutrition, and a resultant surge in other diseases that significantly weakened the general population across large swathes of the continent. Imagine entire regions grappling with chronic undernourishment, their collective immune systems severely compromised, and their energy reserves profoundly depleted by years of hardship. This pre-existing state of widespread physical vulnerability meant that when the plague finally made its horrific arrival, it found a population already susceptible, their bodies less able to mount a robust defense against such a potent new enemy. Furthermore, medieval society, despite its impressive advancements in agriculture, trade, and even early urban planning, operated with extremely limited medical knowledge and a primitive, almost non-existent understanding of disease transmission as we comprehend it today. Imagine learned physicians diligently adhering to the ancient humoral theory, a system of medicine inherited from Greek antiquity, which fundamentally posited that illness resulted from a fundamental imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments consequently often involved ineffective and sometimes harmful practices such as bloodletting, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, or the application of various herbal remedies and poultices, none of which, tragically, possessed any efficacy whatsoever against a bacterial infection like Yersinia pestis. The modern scientific concept of contagion, while observed in practice, people instinctively knew to avoid the visibly sick, was not understood in terms of microscopic organisms passing from one host to another. Instead, people attributed illness to invisible miasma, or bad air believed to carry disease, unfortunate astrological conjunctions, a direct and terrible divine punishment for collective sins, or even malevolent supernatural forces and witchcraft. Imagine the profound helplessness, the crushing lack of effective intervention, when a disease struck with such unprecedented ferocity. Public health measures, as we understand them, were virtually non-existent beyond rudimentary efforts to clean urban streets, to light purifying fires, or to enforce isolated, short-term quarantines during smaller, localized outbreaks, efforts that proved utterly futile and tragically insufficient against a pandemic of this terrifying scale. Clean water sources were often scarce and easily contaminated, personal hygiene practices were rudimentary by modern standards, and basic waste management remained a formidable and persistent challenge even in the most developed urban centers. Added to these complex and compounding factors was the inherent lack of widespread mobility for the vast peasant class, who, as previously mentioned, were largely tied to their feudal lands. While the thriving trade routes facilitated the swift movement of goods and disease across vast continents, the overwhelming majority of ordinary people did not travel widely beyond their local manor or immediate market town. Consequently, when the plague did make its inevitable, terrifying arrival in a village, its inhabitants, with desperately few viable options to flee or isolate themselves, were effectively trapped within their communities, creating intensely concentrated pockets of infection and resulting in catastrophic mortality. Urban centers, with their extreme population densities, labyrinthine narrow streets, and bustling, often unsanitary marketplaces, were particularly vulnerable to the rapid, unchecked spread of the disease. Imagine the sheer concentration of human life in vibrant, densely packed cities like Florence, Venice, or Paris, where tens of thousands lived in remarkably close proximity, sharing common wells, crowded public spaces, and communal living quarters. These conditions provided the perfect breeding ground for exploding populations of rats and their accompanying fleas, and tragically, also facilitated the rapid, unchecked spread of airborne forms of the disease, such as the pneumonic plague, once it established a foothold. Finally, while Europe was undoubtedly becoming increasingly interconnected through its burgeoning trade networks, its political structures remained notably fragmented and decentralized. The Holy Roman Empire, for instance, was more of a loose confederation of diverse territories and semi-independent states than a cohesive, unified nation. England and France were already deeply embroiled in the early, exhausting stages of the protracted Hundred Years' War, a conflict that diverted immense resources, manpower, and political attention away from domestic issues, including public health. The Italian peninsula was a dynamic but turbulent patchwork of fiercely independent, often warring city-states, each with its own internal politics and rivalries. This profound political disunity meant there was no coordinated, large-scale, pan-European response to a public health crisis of this monumental scale. Each city, each kingdom, each feudal lord, was largely left to formulate its own, often desperate, often panicked, and ultimately ineffective responses, leading to varied and, in the face of such an overwhelming force, tragically insufficient reactions that could not hope to contain a global-scale threat. Thus, as the mid-14th century approached, Europe was a continent poised at a truly precarious juncture, densely populated and intricately interconnected by vital trade routes, yet simultaneously weakened by adverse climatic shifts and preceding famines, operating with an extremely rudimentary understanding of disease, and politically fragmented into myriad competing entities. It was a world unwittingly, tragically, and comprehensively prepared for an immense, transformative shock. The stage was tragically, yet meticulously, set for the quiet, inexorable arrival of the unseen traveler from the East. Chapter 2: The Origins and Spread. To truly comprehend the terrifying and transformative arrival of the Black Death, we must first embark on a long, patient voyage back to its enigmatic origins, tracing the faint, almost mythical whispers from the East that would eventually swell into a devastating roar across an entire continent, forever altering the course of human history. This segment will meticulously unveil the probable birthplaces of this great plague, map its ancient, unseen routes of transmission, and finally, chart its inexorable, horrifying march towards the unsuspecting, yet deeply interconnected, shores of Europe. Imagine, if you will, the vast, expansive, and often unforgiving steppes and mountainous terrains of Central Asia. While the precise geographical origin of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the microscopic causative agent of the bubonic plague, remains a dynamic subject of ongoing scientific research and historical debate, current evidence strongly points to these remote, high-altitude regions as the deep, ancient historical reservoir for the disease. Specifically, areas within what is today Kyrgyzstan, nestled close to the formidable Tian Shan Mountains, have yielded compelling archaeological and genetic clues. Recent discoveries have uncovered ancient burial sites from the mid-14th century containing human remains that, when scientifically tested, showed positive indications for the plague bacterium. Crucially, these findings coincide with an unusual and significant spike in local mortality recorded in surviving tombstone inscriptions, dated precisely to the years just before the plague's explosion in Europe. These were landscapes far removed from the bustling, well-documented cities of Europe, places where vast populations of specific wild rodents, marmots, gerbils, voles, and others, lived in close proximity, carrying the plague bacterium in their own natural cycles without always succumbing to it themselves. They were the silent, endemic hosts, their tiny fleas serving as the crucial, unwitting vectors, carrying the disease between rodent colonies. Picture these remote, rugged territories, sparsely populated by nomadic tribes, isolated pastoral communities, and small, self-sufficient settlements, a world seemingly apart, yet, as history would reveal, inextricably linked by the invisible threads of biology and the ancient, persistent pathways of human movement and trade. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, manifests in three primary clinical forms, each with its own terrifying characteristics, that would all play a role during the Black Death pandemic. The most common and recognizable form was the bubonic plague, which primarily infects the lymphatic system. It is characterized by the sudden appearance of painfully swollen, tender lymph nodes, known as buboes, typically appearing in the groin, armpit, or neck regions, often within days of infection. Without treatment, this form had a mortality rate exceeding 50%. Then there was the pneumonic plague, a more virulent, terrifying, and tragically efficient form that directly infects the lungs, leading to a severe pneumonia. This variant was particularly insidious because it could spread directly from person to person through airborne droplets expelled by coughing or sneezing, making it far more contagious and often rapidly fatal, sometimes claiming a life within 24 hours of symptoms appearing. Finally, the septicemic plague was the most rapidly lethal, infecting the bloodstream directly. This form led to widespread internal bleeding, skin turning dark, hence Black Death, and rapid death, often before the characteristic buboes could even form. It is crucial to understand this distinction. While fleas on rats were the primary initial carriers and amplifiers for the bubonic plague, the pneumonic form allowed the disease to bypass the rodent intermediary entirely, jumping directly between humans, especially in the crowded, unsanitary conditions prevalent in medieval towns and homes. The pathway for this ancient, localized, rodent-borne disease to tragically transform into a global human pandemic lay in the intricate, centuries-old networks of the Silk Road. This legendary series of trade routes was not a single, paved superhighway, but rather a vast, complex, and interconnected tapestry of pathways for caravans, a web of trails, mountain passes, and river crossings that tirelessly wove through forbidding deserts, formidable mountain ranges, and fertile oases, linking the distant, powerful empires of China and India with the vibrant civilizations of the Middle East and, ultimately, the emerging societies of Europe. For centuries, this colossal artery facilitated the exchange of an astonishing array of goods, from exotic spices and luxurious silks to precious metals and innovative technologies, but inevitably, and tragically, it also served as an unwitting conduit for diseases. Imagine the slow, relentless, yet persistent movement of these caravans, resilient merchants, their numerous servants, accompanying soldiers for protection, and, critically, their provisions and baggage. These provisions often included large quantities of grains, which, in turn, irresistibly attracted swarms of rodents. As these caravans traversed thousands of miles, stopping at countless inns, bustling trading posts, and major cities along the way, the ubiquitous black rat, Rattus rattus, often called the house rat or ship rat, and its parasitic passengers, the highly efficient fleas, carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium, could travel stealthily with them. A single infected rat, dying quietly along the route, would cause its fleas, now desperate for a new blood meal, to abandon the cooling corpse and seek a new host, perhaps another unsuspecting rat, perhaps, tragically, a nearby human. This slow, steady leapfrogging of the disease, from one rodent population to the next, from one way station to the next, was the silent, inexorable mechanism of the plague's vast expansion across continents. By the early 1340s, this unseen killer had seemingly made its insidious way west, reaching the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, which at its zenith stretched across much of Asia, from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongols, known for their immense territorial reach, their remarkable military discipline, and their surprisingly efficient systems of communication and logistics, inadvertently became powerful, albeit unwitting, carriers and disseminators of the plague. The bustling trade cities under Mongol control, like the flourishing Golden Horde capital of Sarai on the Volga River, became critical hubs for the disease's westward progression. It was likely from these dynamic urban centers and their surrounding territories that the plague finally reached the crucial shores of the Black Sea. Our historical narrative often converges upon a singular, dramatic, and deeply poignant event that serves as a chilling historical marker: the Siege of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, in 1346. Kaffa was a thriving, strategically vital Genos trading post situated on the Crimean Peninsula, serving as an indispensable link between the overland Silk Road routes and the bustling maritime trade lanes leading directly to Europe. Imagine this vibrant port city, its immense warehouses filled to the brim with goods from across Asia, its docks alive with the cacophony of ships, sailors, and merchants. Suddenly, this thriving hub found itself under a protracted siege by the formidable Mongol Golden Horde, led by the astute Khan Yoni Beg. As the siege dragged on, a horrifying, unprecedented new weapon emerged, one that defied all traditional warfare, the plague itself. The Mongol army, already visibly weakened and demoralized by the raging epidemic within its own ranks, began to use what might be considered one of the earliest recorded instances of large-scale biological warfare. According to harrowing contemporary accounts, including that of Gabriel de Mussy, the Mongols launched plague-infested corpses over the city walls using enormous catapults, deliberately aiming to spread the disease among the already desperate defenders. Imagine the psychological terror, the utter despair, the sickening stench as these decaying, disease-ridden bodies rained down upon the besieged city, bringing with them not just physical death and putrefaction, but the unseen, unstoppable force of the plague, a terrifying psychological weapon beyond anything known. Though the exact effectiveness of this particular macabre tactic in single-handedly initiating the epidemic within Kaffa is still debated by modern historians, the disease might have already entered the city through infected fleas and rats scurrying off trade ships or through other, more conventional means. The narrative of the siege undeniably serves as a stark and unforgettable historical marker. Regardless of the precise method of entry, the plague undeniably, chillingly, entered Kaffa. The Genos merchants and sailors, realizing the terrifying futility of their continued defense against this invisible and relentless enemy, made the desperate, fateful decision to flee. Imagine their ships, already laden with valuable goods, human passengers, and, tragically, countless infected rats and their equally infected fleas, frantically setting sail from Kaffa's besieged harbor, seeking refuge and salvation in the familiar, bustling ports of the Mediterranean. From Kaffa, these departing ships became the primary, unwitting vectors, carrying the plague directly into the very heartland of Europe. The journey across the sea was swift, tragically facilitated by the existing, highly efficient maritime trade routes that had for so long been the lifeblood of European prosperity and connection. The first official and widely documented arrival of the Black Death on European soil is often tragically cited as October of 1347, when a flotilla of Genos trading ships, having made their desperate crossing, finally pulled into the bustling harbor of Messina, Sicily. Imagine the dreadful scene that unfolded, vessels easing into the port, their masts silhouetted against the autumn sky, ostensibly seeking refuge or opportunities for trade, but unknowingly carrying a terrible, insidious cargo. Sailors, many already visibly gravely ill, their bodies racked with fever or tragically deceased, bore the horrifying, telltale swellings of buboes, a macabre and unmistakable testament to the new disease. As the remaining, often desperate, crew and passengers disembarked, so too did the infected fleas and their tiny rodent carriers, scurrying quickly onto the busy docks and into the labyrinthine, crowded streets of the city. Within mere days, Messina found itself gripped by an escalating, uncontrollable panic. The disease began to spread with astonishing, terrifying speed, consuming lives indiscriminately. The horrified citizens of Messina, quickly realizing the dreadful source of their unfolding nightmare, desperately attempted to drive the death ships from their harbor, even resorting to setting some ablaze in a futile effort to contain the contagion. But it was far, far too late. The invisible pestilence had already taken root, its insidious tendrils beginning to spread. From Sicily, the plague spread across the rest of the European continent was relentless, inexorable, and terrifyingly swift. It often advanced at an alarming rate of 1 to 3 miles per day overland, a pace of devastation that utterly outstripped any medieval understanding or capability to effectively contain it. By January of 1348, the inexorable tide of death had reached the major, bustling port cities of Genoa and Venice in Italy, the very lifeblood of Mediterranean commerce. Imagine these wealthy, vibrant maritime republics, once thriving centers of trade, banking, and burgeoning Renaissance culture, suddenly and tragically silenced by the encroaching shadow of this unseen enemy. Their bustling markets emptied, their canals grew quiet, their churches filled with desperate prayers. From these vital commercial hubs, the plague radiated outward with terrifying efficiency, infecting the densely populated Lombardy region and moving steadily southward towards the artistic heart of Florence and the sacred, eternal city of Rome, casting its somber pall over every community it touched. Through the spring of 1348, the devastating disease had firmly taken its grim hold across the entire Italian peninsula, leaving widespread death in its wake. Simultaneously, carried by new maritime voyages and overland routes, it had spread rapidly along the sun-drenched French coast, making its catastrophic appearance in the vital port of Marseille by late January 1348. Throughout the long, hot summer of 1348, from Marseille, it surged relentlessly inland through the verdant landscapes of France, sweeping through villages and towns, ultimately reaching the grand, populous city of Paris by June, casting its somber, terrifying pall over the royal court, its scholars, and its vast populace. It also continued its relentless journey northward along the rugged Atlantic coast, arriving at Bordeaux, another critical trading hub. From this port, ships, unknowingly carrying their dreadful, invisible cargo, carried the plague across the English Channel to the unsuspecting shores of England. Indeed, by August of 1348, the plague made its devastating appearance in England, reportedly landing at the humble port of Melcombe Regis, a town now part of modern-day Weymouth. Imagine the profound shock, the escalating horror, and the widespread panic as this unknown, terrifying affliction swept through the tranquil English countryside, ravaging its isolated villages, decimating its farming communities, and then relentlessly moving into its bustling towns and ultimately reaching the sprawling, densely populated, and walled city of London by the grim autumn months. Through late 1348 and into early 1349, the invisible pestilence continued its inexorable march. It moved relentlessly across the diverse terrains of France, Spain, and Portugal, leaving a trail of unimaginable desolation and despair. From these western shores, it then pushed northward across the vast seas, making its grim and chilling appearance in Ireland and Scotland, devastating their smaller, more dispersed communities. From there, it continued its relentless spread into the colder, more remote climates of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, carried by both continued maritime trade and the slow, steady movement along overland routes. It traveled efficiently up major rivers, along established ancient roads, and by the incessant activity of coastal shipping, finding new, helpless victims in virtually every populated area, regardless of size or isolation. Finally, between 1349 and 1351, the terrible wave of plague continued its grim progression across the vast and varied lands of Germany, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. While some of the more sparsely populated regions, particularly those with less intense direct trade connections, sometimes experienced outbreaks that were less immediately ferocious or devastatingly widespread, no corner of the continent was truly spared from its reach. The far-reaching lands of Russia were affected slightly later, by 1351, receiving the plague as a final, chilling wave, arriving from multiple directions. The lack of uniform spread and impact was often due to geographical barriers, slower communication, or simply the chance variations in rat and flea populations, but the underlying threat remained omnipresent. The primary vectors for this relentless and widespread diffusion were, as we noted, the ubiquitous black rat, Rattus rattus, often known intimately as the house rat or ship rat, and its primary parasitic companion, the tiny yet lethally efficient oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis. Imagine the sheer numbers of these rats, thriving in the pervasive unsanitary conditions of medieval towns, homes, barns, and ships, their populations swelling uncontrollably in the abundant waste and refuse. When an infected rat, weakened by the Yersinia pestis bacterium within its body, finally succumbed to the disease and died, its fleas, now desperate for a new blood meal to survive, would abandon the cooling corpse and frantically seek a new host, often a nearby human. Once a human was bitten by an infected flea, the insidious bacteria would enter the bloodstream, and the terrifying, often swift, cycle of the disease would begin its horrific progression within the new host. Furthermore, as the disease became more devastating and widespread, particularly in the later, more intense stages of an outbreak within a given community, the more virulent pneumonic form of the plague tragically became increasingly common. This allowed the Yersinia pestis bacteria to spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, a simple cough, a sudden sneeze, particularly in overcrowded homes, bustling marketplaces, or when people gathered in close, intimate proximity to care for the sick or to perform the sorrowful rites of burying the dead, tragically rendering the rat and flea entirely unnecessary for further transmission. This direct, airborne spread was far more terrifying, less predictable, and chillingly efficient, especially in the cold, damp conditions of autumn and winter, when people huddled indoors for warmth, inadvertently creating perfect conditions for person-to-person transmission. The sheer speed, the unprecedented scale, and the devastating reach of the plague spread utterly defied all medieval understanding and scientific explanation. Without any knowledge of microscopic bacteria, the complex life cycles of fleas, or the specific role of rats, people were utterly helpless, resorting to desperate prayers, ingrained superstitions, frantic, often chaotic flight, or increasingly, to wild accusations and blame. Measures taken, such as attempting to quarantine ships, sometimes for the now legendary 40 days, the very origin of the word quarantine, desperately trying to isolate the sick in their homes, or fleeing from infected urban areas into the presumed safety of the countryside, were often far too little, tragically too late, or simply ineffective against a pandemic whose true mechanisms remained entirely invisible, profoundly unknown, and seemingly unstoppable. The plague's grim march across the continent was not entirely uniform. It sometimes ebbed in its terrifying intensity, occasionally skipping over isolated villages or specific regions only to tragically decimate densely populated towns and cities with brutal efficiency. But its overall pattern was one of inexorable, terrifying progression, leaving behind it a trail of unimaginable devastation, sorrow, and change, acting as a silent, unseen architect of profound, widespread transformation. Chapter 3. The Scourge arrives and devastation unfolds. Imagine the first subtle, insidious signs of the plague's presence within a community. It might begin with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air of a bustling port city like Messina or Genoa. Perhaps a few dock workers, then a merchant, then a baker, would simply not appear for their daily tasks. Initially, these absences might be attributed to common fevers or the general ailments of medieval life. But soon, the signs would become unmistakable and terrifyingly unique. The defining symptom, the hallmark of the bubonic plague, the most common form, was the sudden, alarming appearance of buboes. These were grotesquely swollen, intensely painful lymph nodes, often growing to the size of an apple or even a hen's egg. They typically appeared in the groin, armpit, or neck, areas rich with lymphatic tissue that desperately tried to fight off the invading Yersinia pestis bacterium. Picture a feverish individual, perhaps a robust adult or a frail child, discovering these agonizing swellings, often accompanied by dark, purplish spots on the skin caused by internal bleeding. The word bubo itself comes from the Greek word for groin, a testament to the most frequent location of these grim markers. Accompanying these dreadful buboes were a host of other debilitating symptoms, often appearing with chilling swiftness. A sudden, high fever would grip the body, shaking the victim with uncontrollable chills. Profound weakness and overwhelming fatigue would set in, robbing them of all strength. Excruciating muscle aches and joint pain would make any movement a torment. Many victims experienced nausea, vomiting, and severe headaches, further compounding their suffering. As the disease progressed, delirium often took hold, with victims slipping into states of confusion, wild hallucinations, and incoherent babbling. For those afflicted with the septicemic plague, the bacterium would spread directly into the bloodstream, overwhelming the body's defenses. These victims might not even develop visible buboes. Instead, they would experience rapid onset of high fever, chills, abdominal pain, and widespread internal bleeding, often manifesting as dark, purplish skin lesions, the black spots that gave the Black Death its grim moniker. Their end was often terrifyingly swift, sometimes within a single day. The most horrifying form, the pneumonic plague, was a lung infection. Victims developed a severe cough, often expelling blood-stained sputum. This form, as we noted, was particularly terrifying as it could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, creating localized, fast-moving outbreaks that decimated entire households in mere hours. The sheer speed of the plague's progression was perhaps its most terrifying characteristic. For many, from the first onset of symptoms to the final, agonizing moments of death, the entire ordeal could unfold within 2 to 7 days. For victims of the pneumonic or septicemic forms, this time frame could be even shorter, sometimes less than 24 hours. Imagine the shock, the profound helplessness, as a robust family member, a vibrant neighbor, or a cherished child would suddenly fall ill, their condition deteriorating with unimaginable rapidity, leaving no time for farewells, no space for lingering hope. This swiftness left communities reeling, preventing any coherent response or even adequate understanding of what was happening. The mortality rates were truly catastrophic, unprecedented in recorded history. While precise medieval statistics are difficult to ascertain, modern scholarship estimates that the Black Death claimed the lives of an astonishing 30% to 60% of Europe's entire population in just a few short years, between 1347 and 1351. In some densely populated urban centers, the death toll could reach as high as 70% or even 80%. Imagine a city like Florence, for instance, losing perhaps half its population, its vibrant streets suddenly eerily quiet, its workshops deserted, its churches overwhelmed. The sheer scale of death was simply unimaginable to the medieval mind, accustomed as it was to periods of famine or localized conflict, but never a demographic catastrophe of this magnitude. Entire families were wiped out, leaving no one behind. Villages were depopulated, their fields left untended, their homes standing silent. This was not just a crisis of individuals, but a profound demographic rupture that reshaped the very fabric of society. The initial reactions to the plague's arrival were, quite understandably, a chaotic mix of profound fear, utter confusion, and desperate, often futile, attempts at flight. When the first cases appeared, communities were bewildered. Without any understanding of germ theory or epidemiology, people struggled to comprehend the source of this invisible killer. Was it a punishment from God, a vengeful curse, a corruption of the air, miasma, or perhaps an astrological alignment? These were the prevailing explanations, none of which offered any practical defense. Fear quickly became pervasive, a chilling fog that descended upon every household. Imagine the raw terror as people watched their neighbors, friends, and family members succumb to a disease no one understood and no one could cure. The sight of buboes, the darkening skin, the agonizing cries, and the swiftness of death instilled a terror that transcended all social boundaries. It was a fear that could turn neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, as the desperate instinct for self-preservation took hold. People began to view any sick person, even beloved family, with suspicion and dread, fearing the contagion. Confusion reigned supreme. How could a person be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall? Why did some succumb while others, seemingly exposed, mysteriously survived? Why did prayers seem to go unanswered? The established medical knowledge offered no answers, and religious leaders struggled to provide comfort or explanation that truly reconciled the omnipresent death with their understanding of a benevolent God. This intellectual and spiritual vacuum only intensified the sense of powerlessness. In the face of such incomprehensible devastation, one of the most immediate and instinctive reactions was flight. Imagine those who possessed the means, the wealthy merchants, the nobility, even some skilled artisans, desperately attempting to escape the contagion by fleeing from the densely populated urban centers into the relative isolation of the countryside. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his vivid contemporary account The Decameron, describes how many wealthy Florentines abandoned their homes and fled to country estates, creating small, isolated enclaves where they hoped to escape the plague. However, this flight, while offering temporary respite for some, often inadvertently contributed to the plague's wider spread. Fleeing individuals could carry infected fleas on their clothing, in their baggage, or, if they were themselves infected with the pneumonic form, could carry the disease within their very breath, unknowingly transmitting it to the safe rural communities they sought refuge in. Imagine families traveling for days, desperate for safety, only to unknowingly bring the unseen enemy with them, sowing death in new, pristine locations. Moreover, this exodus often left the sick and the poor behind in the cities, accelerating the breakdown of urban life. The immediate social consequences were profoundly unsettling. Trust began to erode. In some areas, traditional social bonds dissolved as people retreated into isolated fear. Neighbors refused to help the sick. Doctors, priests, and even undertakers sometimes abandoned their duties, terrified for their own lives. Imagine the dead lying unburied in the streets, not because of a lack of willing hands, but because of an overwhelming lack of surviving hands or a profound fear of contact. This breakdown of the fundamental social contract, the implicit understanding that communities would care for their members, was one of the most chilling aspects of the plague's initial devastation. The very rituals of death, the comfort of last rites, the solemnity of burial, were often abandoned in the face of mass fatalities, further traumatizing the living. Consider the sensory experience of a city in the grip of the plague. Beyond the visible buboes and the cries of the sick, imagine the pervasive, sickening stench of decay, not just of human bodies, but of uncollected waste, of abandoned animals, a heavy, cloying odor that hung in the air, fueling the miasma theory and adding to the psychological horror. Imagine the silence, too, in once bustling marketplaces, the absence of familiar sounds of commerce and daily life, replaced by an eerie quiet punctuated only by the tolling of a death bell, or the distant, mournful cries of the afflicted. The psychological toll was immense: widespread despair, profound grief for lost loved ones, and a pervasive sense of doom. The very concept of the future seemed to vanish, replaced by an overwhelming focus on the present, on survival, or on seeking solace in desperate, often extreme, religious devotion. The initial phase of the Black Death's arrival was thus a period of overwhelming chaos and immediate, widespread mortality. It was a time when the very foundations of medieval life, its social structures, its religious certainties, its economic rhythms, were violently shaken to their core. The normal patterns of life simply ceased. Harvests went uncollected. Shops remained shuttered. Courts were abandoned. The living struggled not just with the disease, but with the immense psychological burden of witness, grief, and the breakdown of everything familiar. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of the plague's first, terrifying embrace of Europe. Chapter 4: Societal Collapse and Immediate Aftermath. One of the most immediate, profound, and harrowing consequences of the widespread, indiscriminate death was the catastrophic breakdown of essential services and, most profoundly, the dissolution of law and order. In the initial weeks and desperate months of an outbreak within a given community, be it a bustling urban center, a thriving market town, or a quiet, isolated village, the sheer, overwhelming volume of dead and dying bodies quickly overwhelmed every traditional system designed to manage life and death, commerce, and governance. The familiar figures of medieval authority, the town crier, whose voice once regulated public life, the bailiff, who upheld local laws, the local magistrate, who administered justice, the market master, who ensured fair trade, and even the lower clergy, who provided spiritual guidance, began to sicken and die themselves, often at rates exceeding the general populace. Or, driven by overwhelming, paralyzing fear, they simply abandoned their crucial posts, seeking safety in flight or in secluded isolation. Imagine, if you will, the creeping realization in a town where suddenly the bakers no longer appear to light their ovens, the water carriers cease their vital rounds, and the watchmen vanish from the city gates. The infrastructure of daily life, so often taken for granted in its steady rhythm, simply ceased to function. With the usual authorities either incapacitated, terrified, or entirely absent, the delicate balance of social control and civic responsibility began to fray. Cases of petty crime and opportunistic looting became tragically more common, with desperate or unscrupulous individuals preying on abandoned homes and businesses. The communal bonds that had long governed medieval villages and urban neighborhoods, though strong, were severely tested and, in many cases, tragically fractured under the immense pressure of fear, suspicion, and death. Imagine the terror of being alone in a silent, once bustling city, knowing that the very mechanisms of protection, sustenance, and justice had simply vanished, leaving a terrifying void. This breakdown wasn't always a sudden collapse into anarchy. Sometimes it was a slow, agonizing slide, as one by one, the essential cogs of society ceased to turn, each failure leading to further dissolution. Contracts became unenforceable, debts were uncollectible, and long-standing legal disputes lay unresolved, adding to a pervasive sense of injustice and impending doom. Perhaps the most visceral and immediately horrifying challenge was the grim, overwhelming, and utterly Sisyphean task of mass burials. In normal times, death in medieval society was a deeply communal affair, marked by sacred religious rituals, solemn processions, and the respectful interment of individuals in consecrated ground, often in churchyards close to the community. But during the plague, bodies accumulated with horrifying speed, far outstripping the capacity of existing graveyards, the dwindling numbers of available pallbearers, the overwhelmed priests, and the few remaining grave diggers. Imagine a bustling city like Florence or Siena, where hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of souls died in a matter of mere weeks. Traditional churchyards and burial grounds rapidly filled to overflowing, their hallowed soil unable to receive any more. The air grew heavy with a pervasive, sweet, sickening stench of decay, not just of human bodies, but of uncollected waste, of abandoned animal carcasses, a constant, cloying odor that hung in the air like a shroud, lending credence to the miasma theory of disease and adding immeasurably to the psychological horror. Desperate measures, born of sheer necessity, were adopted. In the largest, most afflicted cities, deep communal pits, known grimly as plague pits or mass graves, had to be hastily dug outside the city walls, often in common fields or unconsecrated ground. Imagine teams of workers, often compelled by civic authorities with promises of payment, or, more likely, desperate for the meager wages that would allow their own survival, toiling relentlessly through day and night. They would haul countless bodies, often naked or hastily wrapped in shrouds, to these vast, gaping trenches, where they were laid row upon row, indiscriminately, almost like cordwood. Priests, if any were still available and brave enough to face the contagion, would offer hurried, collective blessings over hundreds of dead at once, their voices hoarse with exhaustion and grief, or, tragically, sometimes no blessings at all, as the sheer scale of death rendered individual rites impossible. This abandonment of proper, respectful burial rituals was a profound spiritual shock to a deeply religious society, a violation of sacred custom that added immense psychological distress to the already unbearable physical horror. The dead, once honored with solemn rites and a place in communal memory, were now simply raw, anonymous material for an unending, desperate disposal effort, stripped of their dignity in their final moments. The widespread practice of abandonment became a chilling and heartbreaking hallmark of the plague's immediate aftermath. Driven by overwhelming, primal fear of contagion, healthy individuals, even within the closest family units, often made the agonizing decision to abandon the sick and dying. Imagine a husband fleeing his feverish wife, a mother leaving her coughing child, or an adult child making the excruciating choice to leave their elderly, weakened parents to their fate. While seemingly unimaginable in normal times, this was a desperate act of self-preservation, born of the terrifying knowledge that proximity to the visibly ill often meant certain death for oneself and any remaining healthy family members. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his profoundly human and vivid contemporary account The Decameron, recounts how in Florence, many citizens, both noble and common, would shut themselves up in their houses, where they ate little and drank less, giving way to no excesses, but living most temperately. But this often translated into a grim isolation, where the sick were confined to their rooms or even entire houses, left to die alone, or, in more desperate circumstances, abandoned in the very streets, their pleas unheard amidst the general chaos. Imagine the despair of those left behind, knowing they were condemned, surrounded by silence, neglect, and the pervasive fear of the living. The streets of many affected cities and towns became macabre landscapes, strewn with the dead and the dying, their final moments unwitnessed save by the indifferent sky. Domestic animals, too, were often abandoned. Cattle, pigs, and poultry, once vital sources of sustenance, now roamed freely through deserted fields or starved in their neglected pens, adding to the pervasive sense of chaos and desolation. The plague also had a devastating and highly visible impact on the loss of authority figures. The disease was ruthlessly indiscriminate, striking down prince and pauper, bishop and beggar, learned scholar and humble laborer alike. In particular, the clergy suffered immense and disproportionate losses. Priests, monks, friars, and nuns, by the very nature of their sacred vocations, were often at the absolute forefront of caring for the sick, administering last rites, hearing confessions, and performing the grim duty of burying the dead. Their profound spiritual commitment, while inspiring, placed them in direct, constant contact with contagion, often in the most intimate of ways. Consequently, their mortality rates were exceptionally high, often exceeding those of the general population, sometimes reaching 40 to 50% in a single epidemic wave. Imagine entire monasteries wiped out, once vibrant cathedrals standing silent without their priests, and countless villages left without any spiritual guide to offer comfort, lead prayers, or perform essential sacraments. This profound loss of spiritual leadership deeply traumatized a society whose entire worldview, moral compass, and hope for salvation were deeply interwoven with the Church. Beyond the clergy, secular officials also succumbed in staggering numbers. Local magistrates, mayors, sheriffs, royal officials, city councillors, notaries, and even members of royal courts and noble households died, leading to a severe and pervasive disruption of governance at every level. Imagine the immense, almost insurmountable difficulty of maintaining any semblance of order, collecting taxes, or enforcing laws when the very individuals charged with upholding these functions were dying in droves, incapacitated by illness, or paralyzed by fear. Legal systems faltered, administrative functions ground to a halt, and regions were plunged into a terrifying vacuum of power, where traditional justice and order simply ceased to exist, replaced by fear and desperate improvisation. The deepest, most agonizing impact of this societal collapse was felt within the intimate sphere of families and communities. The close-knit, often multi-generational households that formed the fundamental units of medieval European life were torn asunder with chilling speed. Imagine a family, once a vibrant source of strength, mutual support, and shared labor, now witnessing its beloved members fall one by one, often within hours or days of each other. The death of a mother, a father, multiple children, or a cluster of siblings in quick succession left profound emotional scars and irreparable practical devastation. Orphans proliferated across the land, left to fend for themselves in a world already overwhelmed by death and grief, with few institutions capable of absorbing them. Spouses were widowed, often multiple times, in a matter of months, grappling with unbearable loss and the sudden burden of sole survival. The traditional support networks of kinship and neighborhood, which had long provided a vital safety net, simply evaporated as fear and death isolated individuals. The sheer, incomprehensible volume of grief was immense, but often there was no time or emotional capacity to process it. Survivors faced not only the raw trauma of loss but also the daunting practical challenges of continuing life without the loved ones who had been essential to their very survival, who would now work the fields, care for the remaining children, manage the household accounts, or tend to the sick. The familiar rhythm of communal life, shared feasts, vibrant village gatherings, solemn religious festivals, annual markets, vanished, replaced by an eerie silence, a pervasive sense of dread, and a profound, collective trauma that would reverberate through generations. Communities that had once defined individual identity now struggled for their very existence, often seeing their populations reduced to a mere fraction of what they once were, leaving ghostly remnants where vibrant life had once thrived. The phenomenon of flight, as noted in previous segments, had its own profound and often paradoxical consequences, contributing significantly to the chaos and the plague's wider dissemination. While the wealthy, the nobility, and those with means might find temporary refuge in isolated country estates or distant towns, this act of desperate self-preservation often meant abandoning cities to their dire fate. Imagine these desperate refugees, carrying their fears and, often unknowingly, infected fleas on their clothing or in their baggage, or, if they were themselves infected with the insidious pneumonic form, carrying the disease within their very breath. They would unknowingly spread the contagion to previously untouched rural areas and smaller towns. This created a complex dynamic where previously safe regions suddenly faced their own devastating outbreaks, often without the existing, albeit overwhelmed, infrastructure and resources of cities to cope. Rural communities, though less dense, were equally unprepared and found themselves facing the same horrors as their urban counterparts, often with even less medical or governmental support. Furthermore, the flight of the wealthy and powerful often exacerbated the suffering of those left behind in the cities. With patrons gone, trade stalled, and essential services halted, the urban poor, the sick, and the infirm were left to face the full brunt of the epidemic with virtually no support, compounding the chaos, despair, and suffering in these concentrated urban areas. Daily life, in its entirety, was utterly, brutally disrupted. Markets, once the vibrant, noisy heart of medieval towns, fell silent. The clamor of bargaining, the calls of vendors, the hum of commerce, all vanished. Shops were shuttered indefinitely, their goods rotting within, their owners dead or fled. Courts of law ceased to convene, leaving disputes unresolved, debts unpaid, and justice suspended, leading to an informal, often brutal, form of self-governance. Agricultural labor, the very foundation of the medieval economy and its sustenance, ceased in many areas as laborers died or fled. Ripe crops withered unharvested in the fields, valuable livestock roamed unattended or starved in their pens, creating the terrifying prospect of future famine even amidst current abundance, simply because there were no hands left to gather the bounty. Schools and universities closed their venerable doors, their students and masters scattered or dead, marking a temporary but significant halt to intellectual and educational life. The intricate systems of production, distribution, and governance that had slowly evolved over centuries were violently torn apart, replaced by a desperate, day-to-day struggle for basic survival, where each sunrise was a question mark, and each sunset brought new horrors. The psychological toll on survivors was immense, pervasive, and deeply traumatic, leaving lasting scars on the European psyche for generations. Beyond the immediate, agonizing grief for countless dead, a profound and heavy sense of despair settled over many, a gnawing loss of hope for any discernible future. The arbitrariness of death, the chilling randomness of who lived and who died, seemed to defy all logic and human understanding, leading to a deep, unsettling sense of fatalism. For some, this translated into an fervent, almost apocalyptic religiosity, an extreme belief that the end of the world was nigh, prompting desperate acts of penance and self-flagellation, which we will explore further. Others, however, driven by a profound sense of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, turned to stark hedonism, embracing reckless indulgence, debauchery, and a complete abandonment of traditional moral strictures, believing that since death could strike at any moment, the only rational response was to live solely for the present moment. Imagine the stark contrast that emerged: communities torn between desperate, public acts of piety and equally desperate, private acts of moral dissolution. Many survivors also experience profound, lasting trauma, a deep, pervasive survivor's guilt, chronic anxiety, and a pervasive sense of profound insecurity about the future, about life's very unpredictable nature. The trust in established institutions, the venerable church, the seemingly omnipotent government, even the nascent medical profession, was severely shaken, leading to a long-lasting undercurrent of skepticism, questioning, and a nascent individualism that would later contribute to profound societal and intellectual changes, laying a subtle foundation for the Renaissance. Humor often turned dark, interactions became more guarded, and a quiet, watchful suspicion of strangers, and even neighbors, sometimes became the new norm. In essence, the immediate aftermath of the plague's arrival was not merely a period of high mortality, it was a comprehensive and cataclysmic societal breakdown that touched every single fiber of medieval existence. It laid bare the inherent fragility of medieval systems and the deep, often unacknowledged dependency of human life on an unspoken social contract, a delicate balance that, under the unbearable weight of such indiscriminate death, simply could not hold. The world, as it had been known for centuries, was irrevocably changed in a matter of a few short years, plunging survivors into a chaotic, uncertain, yet strangely fertile landscape that desperately demanded new forms of adaptation, resilience, and ultimately, profound reinvention. Chapter 5: Religious Responses and Fanaticism. In an era profoundly shaped by Christian faith, where God's hand was seen in every harvest and every misfortune, the arrival of the Black Death presented an unparalleled theological and spiritual crisis. For how could a benevolent, all-powerful God permit such widespread, indiscriminate suffering? The response was a complex tapestry woven from deep piety, paralyzing fear, and, tragically, desperate attempts to assign blame. At the very core of medieval life stood the Catholic Church, a powerful, pervasive institution that touched every aspect of human existence from birth to death. It was the paramount source of spiritual guidance, moral authority, and social cohesion. When the plague descended, The church was initially the primary institution to which people turned for solace, explanation, and intervention. Imagine the immediate impulse to seek refuge in prayer, to appeal to divine mercy, to participate in rituals believed to appease an angry God. Throughout cities and villages, desperate processionals became a common, mournful sight. Crowds of people, often barefoot and clothed in sackcloth, would walk through the streets, carrying relics, crosses, and banners, chanting litanies and hymns, imploring God's forgiveness. Bishops ordered special masses, fasts, and public prayers. The sacraments, particularly confession and extreme unction, last rites, became desperately sought after, as people yearned for spiritual cleansing and a peaceful passage into the afterlife. However, the relentless and indiscriminate nature of the plague quickly challenged the Church's capacity to respond. As we discussed, the clergy themselves suffered immensely. Priests, monks, and nuns, by virtue of their duties to administer sacraments and care for the dying, were at the forefront of exposure. Their high mortality rates led to a severe shortage of spiritual leaders, leaving countless communities without confession, without Mass, and without the comfort of last rites. Imagine the profound spiritual terror of dying without the Church's final blessings, believing one's soul might be condemned. This crisis of clerical availability profoundly deepened the sense of abandonment and despair felt by the laity. In the vacuum of effective earthly remedies and traditional spiritual solace, the overwhelming belief in divine punishment became the dominant explanation for the plague. For a deeply religious society, the pestilence was widely interpreted as God's righteous wrath, visited upon humanity for its sins. This belief was not merely a theological abstract, it permeated every level of society, from the highest intellectual discourse to the simplest peasant's fearful whisper. Imagine sermons delivered from pulpits across Europe, exhorting congregations to repent, to confess their sins, and to seek atonement, for the sword of God had been drawn. This interpretation led to widespread acts of public penance, self-mortification, and fervent, sometimes desperate, displays of piety. People believed that by demonstrating their remorse and suffering, they might collectively appease God and avert further calamity. This shared belief, while unifying in its theological framework, also bred immense fear and a sense of collective guilt. It was from this fertile ground of fear, despair, and the belief in divine retribution that radical and often terrifying forms of religious fanaticism emerged. The most prominent and disturbing of these were the flagellants. Imagine, dear listener, a spectacle both horrifying and compelling: groups of individuals, numbering in the hundreds or even thousands, marching from town to town, their faces grim, their bodies stripped to the waist, methodically whipping themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. These self-inflicted wounds would draw blood, often dripping onto the streets, as they chanted mournful hymns and preached repentance. Their movement gained immense popularity, particularly in German-speaking lands, the Netherlands, and parts of France, though it eventually reached England. The flagellants believed that by mimicking Christ's suffering, by publicly atoning for their own sins and those of humanity, they could intercede with God and turn away the plague. They rejected the authority of the local clergy and even the Pope, believing themselves to be God's chosen instruments of purification. Their fervor, however, often veered into dangerous extremism, inciting violence against those they deemed sinners or infidels, creating new waves of terror alongside the plague itself. Their public spectacle, while initially providing a dramatic outlet for communal despair, also sowed seeds of social unrest and spiritual rebellion, which the Church eventually felt compelled to suppress violently. Tragically, the profound need for an explanation, coupled with pervasive fear and the flagellants' radical rhetoric, led to a desperate and horrific search for scapegoats. In a world grappling with an invisible enemy, the human mind often seeks a tangible target for its immense suffering and incomprehension. Across Europe, This desperate search tragically coalesced around already marginalized communities, particularly Jewish communities. Imagine the terrifying logic. If the plague was divine punishment, perhaps it was caused by specific human agents, those who were seen as outsiders or enemies of Christ. Rumors, often deliberately spread, began to circulate that Jewish people were poisoning wells, spreading disease through ointments, or conspiring to destroy Christendom. These accusations, utterly baseless and fueled by centuries of anti-Jewish prejudice and economic resentment, led to an horrific wave of persecution and massacres. From the Rhine Valley to Switzerland and beyond, Jewish communities were attacked, tortured into false confessions, and massacred by frenzied mobs, often without any official sanction or, horrifyingly, sometimes with the tacit approval of local authorities who either feared the mobs or wished to seize Jewish property. Imagine the terror of these communities, already living on the fringes of society, now facing a double horror, the plague itself and the murderous rage of their Christian neighbors. Entire communities were annihilated, their homes burned, their possessions looted. Though some rulers, like Pope Clement VI, bravely issued papal bulls condemning the violence and protecting Jewish people, their authority often proved insufficient against the tide of popular hysteria. This dark chapter stands as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and irrationality when gripped by overwhelming fear and suffering, turning an invisible enemy into a tragically visible human one. Beyond the immediate crisis, the plague instigated a profound reinterpretation of divine will and sparked deep theological challenges. If God was omnipotent and benevolent, why would he allow such widespread, innocent suffering? Was he punishing specific sins, or was this a test of faith, or perhaps a precursor to the apocalypse? Different theological schools grappled with these questions, leading to a period of intense spiritual introspection and debate. Some concluded that God's ways were inscrutable, beyond human understanding. Others argued for the inherent sinfulness of humanity, deserving of such a punishment. Yet others began to subtly question the efficacy of traditional prayers and rituals, leading to a burgeoning sense of individual piety and a direct relationship with God, sometimes bypassing the institutional church. Imagine scholars in their cloisters, grappling with ancient texts, searching for answers that never quite came, their intellectual certainty shattered by the incomprehensible reality around them. This spiritual turmoil resulted in a complex and often contradictory dual outcome. For some, the plague led to a profound deepening of piety. Facing imminent death, many turned with renewed fervor to prayer, confession, and charity, embracing asceticism and spiritual devotion, desperately seeking salvation and a place in heaven. New confraternities and charitable organizations emerged, dedicated to caring for the sick and burying the dead, often at immense personal risk, as people sought to live out their faith through selfless acts. Imagine the quiet, unwavering devotion of those who stayed, tending to the sick, offering comfort, even as death surrounded them. However, for others, the overwhelming, seemingly arbitrary nature of the plague led to a profound crisis of faith and a pervasive sense of moral dissolution. If God was truly just, why did the righteous die alongside the wicked? Why did prayer seem to offer no protection? For these individuals, the traditional comforts of religion seemed to crumble. This disillusionment sometimes manifested as a cynical abandonment of moral codes, leading to the hedonism we touched upon earlier, a live for today, for tomorrow we die mentality, characterized by reckless revelry, excessive drinking, and sexual promiscuity. Imagine the stark contrast of a society split between fervent prayer and desperate revelry, each a different response to the same overwhelming despair. This spiritual fracturing, this questioning of traditional authority, would subtly lay groundwork for later religious movements and intellectual shifts, though its full impact would only become clear over centuries. The religious responses to the Black Death were thus a microcosm of the wider societal upheaval, a mix of desperate conformity to traditional beliefs, radical attempts at atonement, and, in some cases, a complete abandonment of previous norms. The Church, though severely weakened by the loss of its clergy and the challenge to its authority, remained a central pillar, but its very foundations had been shaken. The shared ordeal forged new expressions of faith, but also exposed deep fissures of doubt and intolerance, leaving an enduring mark on the spiritual landscape of Europe. The silence of deserted churches, once filled with vibrant congregations, and the desperate, mournful cries of flagellants in the streets, all spoke to a continent grappling with an existential spiritual crisis. Chapter 6: Economic and Labor Transformation. For centuries before the plague, the European economy had largely been characterized by an abundance of labor, particularly peasant labor, which was often tied to the land and held in various forms of servitude. This vast supply of manual labor kept wages low and agricultural output high, forming the bedrock of the feudal system. But the Black Death shattered this centuries-old equilibrium with a sudden, devastating, and irreversible demographic shock. The most immediate and profound economic consequence of the Black Death was, unequivocally, the dramatic and unprecedented labor shortage. Imagine the scale. Across Europe, perhaps 30% to 60% of the population vanished in just a few short years. This meant that millions of farmers, artisans, labourers, servants, and skilled workers simply ceased to exist. Fields lay fallow not for lack of fertile soil, but for lack of hands to plow and harvest them. Workshops stood empty, their tools gathering dust, not for want of demand, but for want of master craftsmen and their apprentices. Mines became silent, construction projects halted, and ships lay idle in ports, all for the same stark reason: the people who performed these tasks were gone. Imagine entire villages where only a handful of survivors remained, their numbers far too few to maintain the complex agricultural systems that had sustained them. This sudden, acute scarcity of human labor was an economic force of unimaginable power, triggering a chain reaction that would ripple through every layer of society. This drastic reduction in the labor supply had an almost immediate and astonishing effect: a significant and widespread rise in wages for the surviving workforce. For centuries, the vast number of peasants and urban labourers had meant that their services were cheap and plentiful. Lords and masters held immense economic power, able to demand extensive labor services or set extremely low wages. But suddenly, the balance of power shifted dramatically. A surviving peasant, once bound to a specific manor, now found that his labor was desperately sought after. Landowners, facing ruin as their crops rotted in the fields, had to compete with each other to attract and retain the few available workers. Imagine a surviving farm labourer, who before the plague might have earned a pittance or been compelled to work for free, now being offered significantly higher daily wages, better living conditions, or more favorable rental agreements to cultivate land. Historians estimate that in many regions, wages for agricultural labourers and skilled artisans rose by 50% to 100%, and in some cases even more, within a decade of the plague's initial passage. This was an economic revolution from the bottom up, fundamentally altering the value of human labor. This newfound economic leverage for the common person directly led to one of the most profound social transformations: the decline of serfdom and the increased freedom and mobility of peasants. Before the plague, serfs were legally tied to the land, unable to leave their manor without the lord's permission, owing a complex array of labor services and feudal dues. The system was based on a vast, fixed labor force. But when labor became scarce and therefore valuable, serfs suddenly had options. Imagine a serf, living under harsh conditions, now hearing whispers of another manor just a day's walk away, where the lord was desperate for hands and offering vastly better terms, perhaps fixed rents instead of labor service, or even the chance to own their own land. Many serfs, emboldened by the changed circumstances, chose to flee their ancestral lands, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. Lords, faced with empty fields and ruin, had a stark choice: either aggressively pursue and punish these runaway serfs, a costly and often futile endeavor given the widespread nature of the phenomenon, or offer concessions to keep their remaining workforce. Gradually, reluctantly, many lords began to commute labor services into money rents, and even to offer fixed, long-term leases on land. This meant that peasants, while still economically dependent, gained greater personal freedom, legal autonomy, and the ability to move and seek better terms for their labor. The economic imperative slowly chipped away at the centuries-old bonds of feudal servitude, accelerating a process of social liberation that might otherwise have taken centuries longer. The dramatic shift in labor availability also triggered significant changes in agricultural practices. With fewer hands to work the land, it became increasingly uneconomical to cultivate marginal, less fertile lands that had been brought under the plough during the population boom of the High Middle Ages. These lands were often abandoned and reverted to pasture. This led to a gradual but profound shift from arable farming, growing crops, to pastoralism, raising livestock, particularly sheep for wool. Sheep farming, after all, required far fewer labours per acre than growing grain. Imagine the vast, open fields, once meticulously cultivated with wheat and barley, slowly transforming into grazing lands for flocks of sheep. This shift had cascading effects. It reduced the demand for grain, leading to a fall in grain prices in some areas, which further benefited the surviving population as bread became cheaper. It also contributed to the growth of the wool trade, spurring new economic activity in textile production in some regions. While this transition took time, its roots lay firmly in the immediate aftermath of the plague and the sudden, acute shortage of agricultural labor. Beyond the countryside, the economic changes reverberated through the urban centers and guild systems. Skilled artisans, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers, also saw their numbers drastically reduced. Guilds, which meticulously controlled the training of apprentices and the entry of new masters into their crafts, faced immense pressure. Imagine a city where half the master weavers are gone, but the demand for cloth remains. The surviving masters could charge higher prices for their goods and demand higher wages for their skilled labor. Apprentices found opportunities to advance more quickly, sometimes becoming masters themselves after shorter training periods than previously required. This upward mobility, though born of tragedy, created new opportunities and challenged the rigid hierarchies of the medieval craft system. The surviving urban populations, with their higher wages and cheaper food, often experienced a noticeable improvement in their material living standards. They could afford better food, more comfortable clothing, and even, for some, small luxuries that would have been unimaginable just a generation before. Imagine the paradox. The world was plunged into chaos, yet the individual survivor often found their personal economic circumstances significantly improved. However, this economic transformation was not without its initial chaos and challenges. The immediate aftermath saw widespread disruption of production and supply chains. With laborers dead, merchants often found their goods rotting in warehouses, unable to be transported or sold. Prices for some goods initially surged due to scarcity, while others, particularly basic foodstuffs like grain in areas of surplus, saw their prices fall due to reduced demand from a smaller population. The flow of commerce was severely impeded. Governments, accustomed to a fixed tax base derived from a large population, found their revenues plummeting even as the need for administrative services, like managing the plague pits, increased. Imagine the immense difficulty in imposing traditional feudal dues or taxes when half the population was gone and the survivors were fiercely demanding better terms. This economic turmoil led to widespread, desperate attempts by authorities to control the chaos. Many governments, reacting to the rising wages and increased peasant mobility, attempted to implement wage freezes and sumptuary laws, laws regulating consumption and dress, to restore the old order. The most famous example is England's Statute of Labourers of 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and compel labourers to work where they were most needed. These laws, however, were largely ineffective and widely ignored. The economic forces unleashed by the plague were simply too powerful to be contained by medieval legislation, leading to widespread defiance, resentment, and, as we will explore, subsequent peasant revolts. The impact of this economic reshuffling also varied significantly by region. Areas that were already densely populated and heavily reliant on labor-intensive agriculture, like parts of England, France, and Italy, experienced the most profound and rapid changes. Sparsely populated regions or those with different economic structures might have seen slower or less dramatic shifts. For instance, in Eastern Europe, where feudal bonds were perhaps even stronger and trade networks less dense, serfdom lingered for centuries longer, though even there the economic currents of the West eventually exerted some influence. Ultimately, the Black Death initiated a profound, long-term shift from a labor-abundant economy to a labor-scarce economy. This fundamental change had cascading effects that reverberated for decades, even centuries. It eroded the power of the landowning aristocracy, who found their traditional wealth base diminished and their control over labor weakened. Conversely, it significantly empowered the common person, the peasant and the urban laborer, who now possessed a commodity, their own labor, that was in high demand. This economic rebalancing contributed directly to the long-term decline of the feudal system and laid crucial groundwork for the eventual emergence of new economic structures, including the very beginnings of a more market-driven economy and a more mobile, free labor force that would characterize the early modern period. The silence in the fields and the empty workshops were not just signs of death, but unwitting heralds of a new, unforeseen, and ultimately more equitable economic dawn for those who survived. Chapter 7: Long-Term Social and Cultural Shifts. One of the most significant and pervasive social transformations was the subtle yet powerful shift in social hierarchy and mobility. For centuries, medieval society had been characterized by rigid, divinely ordained social strata. Those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasants. Social mobility was exceptionally rare, a life station largely determined by birth. However, the plague, in its terrifying indiscriminateness, shattered this long-held rigidity. As we have discussed, the immense death toll meant a drastic reduction in labor at every level of society. Not only peasants but also skilled artisans, master craftsmen, and even lesser nobility and clergy perished in vast numbers. This created an unprecedented fluidity in society. Imagine a surviving peasant, no longer bound by strict feudal ties, who could now demand higher wages or move to a town to learn a new trade, or even purchase land. Opportunities for advancement, once almost unimaginable, now presented themselves to the ambitious and the fortunate survivors. A young apprentice might find himself elevated to a master craftsman simply because all other masters in his guild had died. A common soldier might rise quickly through the ranks due to the decimation of the knightly class. While the overall structure of nobility and commoner remained, the boundaries became far more permeable, and the power dynamic between social classes shifted demonstrably. The laboring classes, who constituted the vast majority, gained a newfound sense of agency and importance, realizing that their numbers, now so tragically reduced, made their contributions indispensable. This newfound, if often unacknowledged, power of the common people directly fueled one of the most dramatic expressions of this shifting social landscape, the series of peasant revolts that erupted across Europe in the decades following the plague. These were not merely random acts of desperation, they were complex manifestations of deep-seated grievances, now amplified by altered demographics and emboldened by a changed economic reality. The ruling classes, facing economic hardship from declining revenues and soaring labor costs, often attempted to reimpose old feudal obligations or enforce wage freezes, such as England's Statute of Labourers. This clash between the aspirations of the newly empowered peasantry and the attempts of the old guard to restore the pre-plague order inevitably led to conflict. Imagine the simmering resentment in the countryside of France, which exploded in 1358 with the Jacquerie. Peasants, pushed to their breaking point by increased taxes, exacerbated by the 100 Years' War, marauding soldiers, and the perceived indifference of the nobility, rose up in a brutal, desperate rebellion against their lords. Though ultimately suppressed with horrific violence, the Jacquerie revealed a deep vein of frustration and a willingness to challenge established authority. Similarly, in England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a watershed moment. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preaching of John Ball, thousands of peasants and disgruntled urban labourers marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, lower taxes, specifically the poll tax, and greater social justice. Imagine the sheer audacity of commoners confronting the king himself, demanding fundamental societal change. While this revolt too was ultimately put down, its demands and the fear it instilled in the ruling class led to a gradual, long-term erosion of serfdom in England and a greater awareness of the common people's grievances. These revolts, born from the unique circumstances of the plague's aftermath, became powerful symbols of the changing relationship between ruler and ruled, hinting at a more egalitarian future, however distant. Beyond the grand social and political upheavals, the Black Death also brought about tangible shifts in diet and living standards for the common people. With fewer mouths to feed and vast amounts of land now available, food became more abundant and, crucially, cheaper. Imagine a surviving peasant or urban labourer, now earning higher wages and paying lower rents, suddenly able to afford a more varied and nutritious diet. Meat, once a rare luxury, became a more regular part of the diet for many. Bread, the staple, became more affordable. This improved nutrition contributed to better overall health for the survivors and their descendants, making them more resilient to subsequent, smaller outbreaks of plague. Housing conditions also saw improvements in some areas. With fewer people, abandoned houses became available, and some survivors could move into larger, more comfortable dwellings. Even clothing became more accessible, as the increased supply of wool from the pastoral shift led to cheaper textiles. This rise in material living standards, paradoxically born of unimaginable loss, contributed to a subtle but significant improvement in the quality of life for the average European, laying groundwork for future economic growth. The economic reshuffling also impacted specific crafts and industries, leading to a decline in some and the emergence or strengthening of others. Those crafts reliant on large, cheap labor forces, or those associated with practices now deemed dangerous, saw disruption. Conversely, industries related to textiles, especially wool, as well as those that adapted to higher labor costs through innovation, saw growth. The demand for various goods might have initially plummeted with the population, but as wages rose, new patterns of consumption emerged. Furthermore, the death of so many skilled masters meant a temporary loss of accumulated knowledge and expertise in certain areas, forcing a period of rebuilding and, sometimes, invention of new methods or tools. This dynamic of loss and adaptation was a constant theme in the post-plague world. Culturally, the Black Death left an indelible mark, most notably in the realm of art and literature. A profound fascination with mortality and death permeated artistic and literary motifs. Imagine the stark and powerful imagery of the Danse Macabre, Dance of Death, which became a popular allegorical motif in paintings, frescoes, and woodcuts across Europe. This motif depicted figures from all walks of life, kings and queens, bishops and peasants, knights and merchants, dancing hand in hand with personified skeletons, illustrating the universal power of death and its indiscriminate nature. It was a potent visual reminder that no one, regardless of wealth or status, was immune to the Grim Reaper. Literature, too, took on a somber tone. Works like Boccaccio's The Decameron, while framed by tales, opens with a chilling and vivid description of the plague's impact on Florence. Poetry and chronicles often dwelled on themes of loss, suffering, and the transient nature of life, a stark contrast to the more idealized heroic narratives of earlier medieval periods. This cultural preoccupation with death was not merely morbid, it was a societal attempt to process unimaginable trauma, to find meaning in inexplicable loss, and to reflect on the fragility of human existence. Perhaps one of the most subtle, yet far-reaching, cultural shifts was the burgeoning sense of increased individualism and a nascent questioning of traditional authority. When God's wrath seemed so arbitrary, when the church's clergy died alongside their flock, and when feudal lords proved unable to protect their peasants, individuals were forced to rely more on their own judgment, their own resilience, and their own direct relationship with the divine. Imagine the individual survivor, having witnessed the failure of established institutions, developing a more skeptical and self-reliant perspective. This questioning laid crucial, if unacknowledged, groundwork for the intellectual ferment that would characterize the Renaissance. The focus began to subtly shift from the collective and the divine hierarchy to the individual's experience, fate, and potential. This was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, gradual awakening that would gain momentum in the centuries to come. Finally, the plague also brought about significant changes in family structures and relationships. The loss of multiple family members often led to smaller family units. The high mortality meant that remarriage became very common, often multiple times for survivors, leading to complex blended families and new inheritance patterns. With fewer people, some surviving children might inherit land or wealth at a much younger age than they otherwise would have, propelling them into positions of responsibility prematurely. The concept of kin might have expanded to include neighbors and non-blood relatives in a desperate effort to rebuild support networks, or, conversely, it might have contracted due to the fear and abandonment that occurred. The psychological impact of witnessing such widespread death also created a generation marked by collective trauma, shaping their worldview and relationships, often leading to a more cautious, yet sometimes more opportunistic, approach to life. In essence, the Black Death, while a period of unprecedented human tragedy, also acted as a powerful, albeit brutal, catalyst for change. It shattered the rigid structures of the High Middle Ages, creating a more fluid, dynamic, and ultimately more adaptable society. From the depths of despair and loss, the seeds of a new Europe were sown, a Europe characterized by greater social mobility, changing economic relations, a re-evaluation of authority, and a profound, often somber, introspection that would eventually give rise to the intellectual and artistic flowering of the Renaissance. The echoes of the plague's passage resonated not just in the silent fields, but in the evolving hearts and minds of its survivors, shaping the very cultural soul of the continent. Chapter 8: Medical and Scientific Evolution. Imagine a medieval physician, learned in his craft, meticulously trained at a university in the ancient texts of Galen and Avicenna. His diagnostic tools were limited to observing the patient's complexion, pulse, urine, and stool, and eliciting a careful account of their symptoms. His treatments were then invariably directed at restoring the perceived humoral balance. This meant the widespread practice of bloodletting, where blood was drawn from the patient to reduce an excess of blood. Imagine the visual of patients, already weakened by fever, being bled, often until faintness, in a futile attempt to cure them. Other common treatments included purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea with strong emetics and laxatives to expel perceived excess humors, and the application of various herbal remedies and poultices, many of which might have offered palliative relief from symptoms but possessed absolutely no efficacy against a bacterial infection like Yersinia pestis. Dietary regulations and environmental adjustments, such as ensuring good air and proper moderation, were also key components of their therapeutic approach. In essence, medieval medicine was largely philosophical and theoretical, deeply reliant on ancient authority, with limited empirical observation and virtually no understanding of germ theory, epidemiology, or human anatomy. When the Black Death arrived, it presented an immediate and overwhelming intellectual crisis for physicians and scholars. The sophisticated frameworks of humoral theory, which had seemingly explained every ailment from a common cold to a chronic fever, utterly failed to account for the plague's rapid onset, its terrifying symptoms, its indiscriminate nature, and its horrifying mortality rates. Patients died regardless of their humor balance, their social standing, or the physician's most diligent efforts. Imagine the despair and profound confusion of these learned men, watching their entire body of knowledge crumble before an unstoppable, inexplicable force. Their incantations, their bloodlettings, their purges, all were tragically useless. This systemic failure of the established medical paradigm shook the very foundations of medical thought, creating a desperate intellectual vacuum and a powerful, albeit often unacknowledged, impetus for new understanding. Despite the lack of a germ theory, medieval people, through sheer observation, had developed a rudimentary, intuitive understanding of contagion. They observed that those who came into contact with the sick often fell ill themselves, and that disease seemed to spread from person to person. This practical observation led to the implementation of early, albeit rudimentary, public health measures even before the plague, but which were dramatically amplified and formalized in its wake. The concept of miasma, or bad air believed to carry disease, was the prevailing theoretical framework for understanding contagion. Imagine the widespread belief that foul odors, putrid swamps, and decaying matter were the sources of pestilence. This belief led to efforts, however rudimentary, to clean urban streets, remove refuse, and burn aromatic herbs or light purifying fires in public spaces, measures intended to clear the bad air, though their direct impact on the plague's spread was minimal compared to targeting its true vectors. However, the scale and terror of the Black Death forced a more pragmatic and rigorous approach to containment. The most significant innovation in public health born from this period was the concept of quarantine. While the term itself wasn't coined until later, from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days in Italian, the practice began in Italian port cities like Venice and Ragusa, Dubrovnik. Imagine the authorities of these bustling maritime republics observing that plague often arrived on ships. Their response was to hold incoming ships, their crews, and their cargo in isolation for a prescribed period, initially 30 days, then famously 40 days, before allowing them to enter the city. This was a radical departure, a direct recognition that separation from the perceived source of infection was the only effective defense. These were the earliest, most direct forms of disease containment policies, born not of scientific understanding of bacteria, but of stark, brutal empirical observation. When we do this, fewer people die. This pragmatic, defensive posture would evolve over centuries, becoming the foundation of modern public health. Pest houses or lazarettos also began to emerge, isolated facilities outside city walls where the sick could be confined, ostensibly to prevent further spread, though often serving as places where the infected were simply left to die. Paradoxically, the immense death toll provided an unprecedented, if macabre, opportunity for advancements in anatomical knowledge. Before the plague, human dissection was rare and often prohibited by religious or social taboos, limited to occasional criminal cadavers or animals. Most medical understanding of internal anatomy was derived from the ancient texts of Galen, who had primarily dissected animals. However, with bodies piling up in the thousands, and the sheer necessity of understanding the terrifying internal manifestations of the buboes and dark lesions, authorities in some universities and cities relaxed these restrictions. Imagine medical students and physicians, compelled by necessity and intellectual curiosity, finally having access to human cadavers in unprecedented numbers. This allowed for direct observation of internal organs, the pathology of the plague, e.g., swollen lymph nodes, inflamed lungs, and a gradual correction of long-held anatomical misconceptions derived from animal dissection. While not leading to immediate breakthroughs in treatment, this direct, hands-on study of human anatomy was a crucial step in the long, slow shift from theoretical reliance on ancient texts to more empirical, observational approaches in medicine. It nurtured a spirit of inquiry and a willingness to challenge established wisdom based on what could be directly observed. This nascent spirit of observation began to slowly challenge the absolute authority of ancient medical texts. While Galen and Hippocrates remained revered, their limitations in explaining the plague became starkly apparent. Physicians began to compile their own observations, creating plague treatises that detailed symptoms, progression, and various, often still ineffective, remedies, but which were, crucially, based on their own direct experiences rather than solely on ancient wisdom. This marked a subtle, yet significant, shift from an entirely text-based authority to one that gradually incorporated direct, empirical evidence. The experience of the plague compelled many to think critically about the nature of disease in a way that previous, less catastrophic epidemics had not. It is crucial to acknowledge, however, that these shifts were glacial in pace and did not lead to an immediate scientific revolution. Medieval scientific method, as we understand it, was still nascent. Astrology continued to play a significant role in medical diagnosis and prognosis, and superstitious beliefs persisted alongside genuine observation. The microscope was centuries away, and the understanding of microorganisms was utterly inconceivable. Yet, the Black Death acted as a relentless, brutal teacher. It exposed the fundamental limitations of the existing medical paradigm, forced practical innovation in public health, and opened a crucial, if narrow, window into human anatomy through dissection. It demonstrated, with horrifying clarity, that observable phenomena, even if not fully understood, could provide practical benefits in the face of an otherwise uncontrollable threat. The quiet intellectual struggle of this period, born of immense suffering, subtly laid crucial groundwork for the later, more explosive scientific advancements of the Renaissance and beyond, nudging humanity just a little further along the long path from superstition to rigorous scientific inquiry. Chapter 9: Aftershocks and Enduring Impacts. For while the initial, terrifying wave of 1347 to 1351 eventually receded, its profound influence did not vanish with the last death. Instead, it reverberated through centuries, meticulously shaping the course of European history in ways both direct and indirect, leaving an indelible mark on demography, society, culture, governance, and the very identity of a continent. It was not merely an event, a passing catastrophe. It was a profound catalyst, a merciless crucible in which the old world, the familiar medieval order, was fundamentally melted down, and a new one, resilient and often unexpectedly vibrant, slowly, painstakingly, and sometimes agonizingly, forged. One of the most crucial and terrifying aspects of the plague's enduring legacy was its insidious recurrence. The Black Death was emphatically not a singular event that struck once and then vanished from memory. For the next 3 centuries, and even beyond into the early modern period, outbreaks of plague, often devastating in their own right, became a terrifyingly familiar, if unpredictable, aspect of European life. Imagine generations born into a world where the great mortality of their grandparents' hushed tales could, and often did, return with chilling regularity. While these subsequent epidemics, such as the brutal plague of 1361–62, often grimly referred to as the peste des enfants, children's plague, due to its disproportionate and heartbreaking impact on a younger, less exposed generation, or the widespread outbreaks of the 17th century that ravaged major cities like London, 1665, and Milan, 1630. And sporadic occurrences well into the 18th century rarely matched the sheer, continent-wide devastation of the first, initial wave. They nevertheless kept the memory of the great pestilence alive. They continued to exert relentless pressure on population growth, constrained economic recovery, and frequently shattered the fragile attempts at societal rebuilding. However, over these long centuries of recurrence, European societies, through necessity and bitter experience, gradually developed remarkable adaptations. These were not swift, immediate breakthroughs, but slow, empirical improvements. Cities, particularly the prosperous port cities that were often the first to be reinfected, implemented more formal and rigorously enforced quarantine measures. They refined the rudimentary practices first seen in Italian ports, establishing dedicated health councils and watchmen to monitor incoming ships and travelers. Imagine the sight of quarantine flags fluttering from ship masts in a harbor, signaling their enforced isolation, or the solemn edicts posted at city gates, forbidding entry to those from infected regions. Local and national governments, in response to the overwhelming burden of repeated outbreaks, began to create rudimentary public health boards or magistri sanitatis. These nascent bodies were responsible for managing outbreaks, enforcing the isolation of the sick, organizing the collection and burial of the dead in special cemeteries, and even, crucially, compiling mortality records, the very hesitant beginnings of public health infrastructure and vital statistics. While rudimentary, these were critical steps towards a more organized and secular approach to disease control, pushing beyond purely religious interpretations. Imagine, too, the emergence of specialized, if often grim, figures like the plague doctors, cloaked in their distinctive leather gowns and bird-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believed to filter miasma. While their treatments were largely ineffective and their appearance terrifying, their very existence signaled a societal attempt to professionalize the response, to contain the horror, and to provide some semblance of order in the face of chaos. Personal hygiene, while still far from modern standards, saw subtle, gradual improvements in some urban areas, and a more generalized, intuitive understanding that bad air was associated with filth and decay encouraged some forms of rudimentary sanitation, like the removal of waste and the cleaning of public spaces. Houses were sometimes abandoned or even ritually burned if plague struck within their walls, and people learned, if they could afford the means, to flee from infected urban centers, often retreating to the perceived safety of the countryside for the duration of an outbreak. These were not scientific cures, for the true cause remained unknown for centuries, but they were pragmatic, hard-won lessons in containment, mitigation, and survival that allowed populations to recover more quickly and to mitigate the worst effects of subsequent waves, slowly building a collective, albeit often fearful, resilience. Beyond the immediate and recurring outbreaks, the Black Death played a truly pivotal and inescapable role as a major catalyst for the decline of the Middle Ages. The traditional pillars of medieval society, the intricate feudal system and the ubiquitous, seemingly unshakable absolute authority of the Church, were profoundly, almost irrevocably, weakened by its devastating passage. The feudal system, already facing subtle challenges from the growth of towns and a nascent money economy, suffered an irreparable, fatal blow from the immense labor shortage. As we discussed in our previous segment, the sheer scarcity of peasant and artisan labor fundamentally altered the power dynamic between lords and serfs, leading to higher wages, increased personal mobility, and the gradual, inexorable erosion of serfdom in Western Europe. Imagine the centuries-old bonds of land, loyalty, and compulsory service slowly dissolving, not through grand legal reforms, but through the relentless, practical pressure of economic reality. Peasants, now a valuable commodity, could demand better terms, pay money rents instead of labor service, or simply leave for greener pastures. The landowning aristocracy, once supreme, found their traditional wealth base diminished, their control over their workforce severely curtailed, and their very social standing challenged by a newly empowered peasantry. This forced a transition from a labor-intensive, land-based economy to one that began to value capital and, crucially, a more mobile and free workforce. The Catholic Church, too, while remaining deeply influential in the spiritual lives of millions, faced an unprecedented crisis of authority and spiritual confidence. The devastating loss of its clergy, from humble parish priests to powerful bishops and abbots, was a literal decapitation of its organizational structure. More profoundly, the perceived failure of prayers, processions, and holy relics to halt the pestilence, coupled with the profound disillusionment sparked by the seemingly arbitrary nature of divine judgment, why did the pious die alongside the wicked, led to widespread questioning of the Church's efficacy and even its moral integrity. Imagine the lingering skepticism towards an institution whose spiritual remedies seemed utterly ineffective against the Great Death. This profound challenge to its moral and intellectual authority, combined with existing internal issues such as widespread corruption, clerical absenteeism, and the devastating papal schism, which saw multiple competing popes vying for authority later in the century, opened the door for future religious reform movements. It fostered a more direct, individualistic approach to faith, subtly yet powerfully paving the way for the Reformation, almost 2 centuries later. The plague, in essence, accelerated the dismantling of an old order, already creaking under its own internal contradictions, making way for something entirely new. Paradoxically, the Black Death, while a source of unspeakable suffering, also served as a profound, if brutal, contributor to the rise of the Renaissance. The immense demographic shifts and economic rebalancing created entirely new, unforeseen opportunities. With land suddenly abundant and labor scarce, wealth became more fluid, gravitating towards surviving merchants, skilled artisans, and those who could adapt to the new economic realities. Imagine a surviving merchant family, now able to accumulate greater wealth, with newfound social mobility and a willingness to invest this surplus in secular pursuits rather than solely in traditional religious endowments. The decline of the feudal system and the weakening of the Church's absolute intellectual grip allowed for a greater focus on human achievement, classical learning, and worldly pursuits, the very essence of humanism. The valuing of individual human life, ironically highlighted by its widespread, indiscriminate loss, contributed to a burgeoning sense of individualism. People were forced to rely more on their own ingenuity, their own resilience, and to forge a more direct relationship with the divine, bypassing traditional intermediaries. This fostered an intellectual environment ripe for renewed curiosity, a re-engagement with ancient Greek and Roman texts, many of which had been preserved in monastic libraries or brought from the Byzantine East, and astonishing artistic innovation. The vibrant new art and literature of the Renaissance, while often still bearing the somber echoes of mortality in their themes, also brimmed with a profound celebration of human potential, the beauty of the natural world, and the richness of earthly life. The economic basis of this new cultural flourishing was undeniably linked to the reshuffling of wealth the plague had initiated, allowing for unprecedented patronage of the arts and sciences. Demographically, the plague's impact was truly staggering and profoundly long-lasting. Europe's population would not fully recover to its pre-1347 levels for another 200 to 250 years, well into the 16th or even 17th century, depending on the region and its specific experience of subsequent outbreaks. Imagine the sheer scale of generational loss, the vast number of vacant lands, the reduced population densities, and the ghost of vanished communities lingering for centuries. This extended period of lower population density profoundly shaped economic development, land use, with more land available for pasturage or communal use, and the pace of urbanization for generations. It also meant less pressure on finite resources, contributing to higher material living standards for survivors and their descendants, as previously discussed, creating a unique demographic bottleneck that paradoxically improved the lot of those who remained. The psychological impact on subsequent generations was equally profound, leaving deep, often unspoken, scars on the European psyche. The memory of the Black Death, passed down through oral tradition, stark art, like the Danse Macabre, and haunting literature, became an integral, somber part of the collective consciousness. Trauma, pervasive grief, and a profound sense of fatalism. We are all mortal, and death can come at any time, for any reason, undoubtedly lingered. This fatalism sometimes manifested in a carpe diem or seize the day mentality, encouraging a focus on present pleasures and even hedonism, as observed by Boccaccio. But it also bred a greater, almost visceral, awareness of human vulnerability and the inherent fragility of life. For centuries, Europeans lived with the unspoken, underlying understanding that the Great Plague could return, fostering both a subtle caution in daily life and an underlying existential anxiety. This collective experience fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with death, making it a more immediate and stark presence in everyday life, popular imagination, and religious thought. Finally, the Black Death offers invaluable enduring lessons for public health and disease preparedness, lessons that resonate with chilling prescience even in our modern, scientifically advanced world. It starkly revealed the devastating consequences of a lack of medical understanding, a fragmented and uncoordinated political response, and pervasive societal vulnerabilities in the face of a global pandemic. Imagine the distant echoes of medieval quarantines in our modern disease control strategies, or the initial confusion, misinformation, and desperate search for scapegoats finding unsettling parallels in later outbreaks, including our own recent experiences. The plague, through its sheer, overwhelming devastation, inadvertently pushed humanity towards a more empirical, organized approach to disease management, laying the very groundwork for epidemiology, robust public health infrastructure, and eventually, the systematic scientific inquiry that would lead to modern medicine. It highlighted the critical importance of a coordinated, scientific, and compassionate response to global health threats, a profound lesson that humanity continues to relearn with each new pandemic, often through hardship and loss. The eventual disappearance of the plague in Europe remains a complex and fascinating historical enigma. While isolated outbreaks continued, the full-scale, widespread epidemics began to decline significantly in the 18th century and largely vanished from Western Europe by the early 19th century, though it lingered in other parts of the world. Transformative force that reshaped the demographic, economic, social, cultural, and even intellectual landscape of Europe. It accelerated the decline of the medieval world, paradoxically paved the way for the vibrant flourishing of the Renaissance, spurred crucial innovation in medicine and public health, and left an enduring psychological imprint. The whispers from the East that began this journey swelled into a roar of devastation, but ultimately they forged a new Europe, one that, through profound suffering, was irrevocably propelled onto the path that would lead to the very foundations of the modern world. The echoes of the plague's passage resonate not just in the silent fields and the crumbling ruins, but in the evolving hearts and minds of its survivors and their descendants, shaping the very cultural and historical soul of the continent, a testament to both profound loss and remarkable, quiet human adaptation. Thank you for joining Restful Historian on this tranquil, immersive journey through the depths of the Black Death and its enduring legacy. May its profound lessons serve as a quiet, yet powerful, reminder of both the inherent fragility and the extraordinary, quiet resilience of the human spirit. Good night.